nice to be here with, well, two living legends at the very least, because I've known Geoffrey for many years, and he is indeed a living legend in recording circles around this town. And also for the Smallwoods annual Epiphany Tide Party, which is known and celebrated far and wide. And then, of course, Tony Faulkner, your president. Well, when I last saw Tony, which was some months ago in Watford Coliseum, which is a wonderful recording venue where he's worked many, many times. I've worked just a few times. I reminded him that he was now in the same legend category as the Earl of Sandwich, the Duke of Wellington, and Mr. Hoover, because in textbooks on sound, you will find references to the Faulkner pair. And so there you are. He's got a microphone array named after him. Beat that, you know. I mean, I always tell people in America, if you really want to aspire to immortality, invent a domestic appliance. I like a Hoover, I suppose. But anyway, it's nice to be here. As Geoffrey said, I've always had an interest in sound recording. I mean, music is where I am, in a sense. That's my day job. And as you will know with music, you don't choose it as a way of life, it chooses you. But at the same time, I've always loved electronics. And going back to the era when valves glowed and things took a while to warm up with your television set and then disappeared into that absolutely. It was my pleasure to read, I'm sure it's long defunct, was it called Practical Wireless or was it called Wireless World? And I actually built my own stereo amplifier, not to my own design, but not from a kit either. And it worked. And it had valves and all sorts of things. So it's something which has always fascinated and intrigued me. Nevertheless, I come at sound recording, I suppose, from a musician's perspective, which is one that's going to irritate sound recorders no end, which is this, that a sound recording really is like a photograph. It's just a memento of live music making. And as we all know, that an old, blurred, black and white photograph of somebody we love, perhaps, you know, taken on the beach 50 years ago, can be more powerful and evocative than your 6 million pixel digital, all singing, all dancing, color photographs of someone's boring holiday. And so, in a sense, it's what you record that matters most. And listening, as I was just the other week, to recordings of Grieg playing his own piano music in 1904, recorded in Paris, it's fine. You know, it's perfectly fine. I mean, yes, it's somewhat scratchy, but you can tell an awful lot about the playing. And for me, it's actually a very powerful document. And so, in a sense, like a lot of musicians, I suppose I accept that no recording is ever the same as the real thing. And you will put up with quite a lot. I mean, when you're listening to your kitchen radio, you know perfectly well that it's not brilliantly good sound, but you may or may not be engaged by what that people are actually saying or playing on it. None of that, of course, has stopped people wanting to record music better. And the record industry has always been driven by new technology. And there's been a long history of it that I suppose whoever it first was about 100 years ago who went from wax cylinders to round, flat platters made a big step forward. And then at the end of the, well, long before the end of the era of 78s, electrical recording came in the mid-1920s, which made it possible to record instruments like, for example, the guitar, which had never been possible really to record before, and to record orchestras in something more like a natural array and layout. That was a big step forward. And of course, a boom in the record industry followed. Then, late 1940s, early 50s, in came LP. Shortly before that, of course, thanks to World War II, I suppose, military technology, in came magnetic tape. That made a big difference. There was a great milestone in the history of recording when Kirsten Flagstad was unable to sing the one top C in Tristan and Isolde. and Decca were recording it because they wanted a document of a historic interpretation of the role. But the fact was she couldn't manage that one note. And a very young Elizabeth Schwarzkopf was drafted in to just sing the one note. And it was sliced in on the tape. After that, nothing has been the same, as I think Tony would agree. Once people realized you could cheat, they did. And so that was, I suppose, something which drove a great change in the way that recordings were made. 1958, thereabouts, in came stereo, though, of course, as you will all know, experiments in it were first done way back in the 1930s. I believe there may even be some recordings that survive, but the chap behind a lot of that, interestingly, went to my old school at Highgate. Bloomline was his name, and he went to Highgate, apparently. So LPs were a wonderful excuse to re-record everything. Stereo was a wonderful excuse to re-record everything. Compact discs came in 1983, and that was a wonderful excuse to re-record everything. Trouble with them is, from the economic point of view, that they don't wear out. They're non-biodegradable. You can't damage them easily, and they don't warp if you leave them near a radiator, and if you drop them, they don't break. Well, of course, LPs didn't either, but 78 certainly did. And CDs have now been with us for, oh, would you believe it? It doesn't seem that long, but it is over 20 years. They're not a new technology. And because I think the pattern of the record industry and the work that musicians can get from it, and that indeed consumers can get from it, tends to be driven by new technological change. It's curious that we've got a whopping great technological change that has just come about in recording, which really people seem not to be looking at. It's like the elephant in the living room in a way, or perhaps more specifically, it's the 5 or 6 speakers in the living room. And I'm talking, of course, about surround sound. And that's really the theme of this session this afternoon, because I remember first hearing surround sound back in 1973, I think it was, in the control room in the Gibbs building next to King's College Chapel. Now, at that time, EMI were experimentally recording King's College Choir in surround. The idea being, I don't know whether you remember this because it was rather short-lived, for a while there was quadraphonics on LP, 4-channel LPs, and EMI were recording that way, and they released commercially a very few recordings that way, but the fact is it didn't catch on. I suppose, apart from anything else, an ordinary microgroove is not a very good medium for conveying 4 separate channels, that there would be too much crosstalk between them. And so that never really happened, but what I do remember is that I listened to King's College Choir in the control room in 4 tracks, and I was absolutely bowled over, as was David Wilcox, the director of King's College Choir. And I remember him saying to Christopher Bishop, who was the producer, he said, well, that's absolutely faithful, absolutely faithful. And the engineers all smiled and said, well, enjoy it now, because I'm afraid it's going to get mixed down to 2 tracks, and it won't be the same anymore. But I remember thinking then, what a wonderful medium of sound this was, particularly if the building itself is a part of the experience of the music. I mean, all music, I think, does benefit from surround sound, but particularly something like music recorded in King's College Chapel, where the building itself is a part of the music that you're hearing. I mean, with that wonderful, beautiful, long decay, that lovely, majestic reverb, it does affect what you hear and what you experience, and you can't really capture that on just 2 channels. I would say that, in my view, surround sound is as much of a step forward from stereo as stereo was from mono. But yet, things have got all messed up for reasons that I'll talk about in a moment. Now, I suppose we're most familiar with surround sound, really not from home listening at all, but from the cinema. And slightly tongue-in-cheek, let me just play you. can almost taste the popcorn and the ice cream, can't you? That's music by Jerry Goldsmith, with the LSO in full cry, recorded in Watford Coliseum. That's music from his film of Star Trek. And the thing is, don't ask me why the glockenspiel comes from behind you, particularly, but I think when the sound engineer makes a recording like that, they're not particularly trying to create a realistic experience. They're creating a larger-than-life experience to be enjoyed in the cinema. And I think it's grand fun and super and terrific and theatrical and all of that, so why not? A little more seriously, but still in Watford Coliseum, here's a recent recording of the Brahms First Symphony. Well, now, I don't know whether you felt as dramatically as I did, but the moment you take the rear speakers away, it's like going from colour into black and white again. There's nothing wrong with, well, it's 3 channels we're left with. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But for me, even though one isn't necessarily conscious of the sound that's coming from behind you, that's what tells your brain, I'm in Watford Coliseum. Because that directional information is, for me, what fills the sound out and just makes it that more real. What about voices? Here's this is, again, a recent recording of, well, a piece that you'll all know very well. This is the Canteloube Chant d'Auvergne, a sort of piece of instant France for you. Shame to leave it. It's a lovely piece, but again, I think that has a beautiful sense of space and focus and reality, that the orchestra is stretched out. You can shut your eyes and there's the soloist. What about something where the building itself is important? Here's a recording made in one of my absolute favorite buildings for unaccompanied choral singing. And I don't know if you've all visited it, the Lady Chapel of Ely Cathedral. It's very reverberant, but I think it's absolutely wonderful and inspiring as a building. Let me just find, if I can, here we go. Yeah, try this. That's the choir of Clare College, conducted by Chris Brown's brother, Tim Brown. And the album's called Light of the Spirit. And really, all you have to do in the Lady Chapel is just stick up any sort of a microphone, and the building will do the work for you. It's very simply recorded. The front pair was a sound field, and what you're hearing from the center channel, the customers have paid for a center channel, so they want to hear something coming out of it. And what I actually did was mono out to the center channel a second pair of microphones, which I had, I suppose, about 10 feet behind the first, and introduced a delay into the first to just even them out a bit. And then the two rear speakers, what you're hearing was just another single point stereo pair that was at the very back of the building. And you have to actually to have been in that building to appreciate how extraordinary the acoustics are. But it seems to me that that really does gain a lot from being heard in 5 channels. What you may ask about the 6th channel, the subwoofer, those big cubes that they want you to put in your living room. For organ music, I would say there's some point in them. For music like this, there really isn't a lot of point because there's all the bass that you want. One of the extraordinary things I think about surround sound is how it seems to just richen the bass response as compared with what you'd hear with 2 channels. So why isn't everybody jumping around and buying these? Well, it's interesting. The record industry itself has partly had a loss of confidence, I think, because if you go into, big record shops like Virgin in Piccadilly Circus, the SACD rack will only be about that wide, And of course, what's made things more complicated is that there's been a format war going on because there are 2 rival formats for surround sound. There's SACD, which is what you've been listening to, and DVD-A. And the problem with DVD-A is that in order to find a track on a recording, you actually need a television screen. So you have to connect it up to a TV or it doesn't really work. And so, the idea is it would be part of your home entertainment system, I suppose. But that hasn't really taken off. And as always, when there's a format war, then in a sense everybody loses. That they should have all agreed on either one or the other. And then that might have meant that commercially there would be more confidence in the product. Some of those recordings I've been playing you are Naxos, and they are actually backing SACD rather more than some of the more expensive labels are. And those were very good performance of the Brahms there, very good performance of the Canteloup Chant d'Auvergne, £8.99. Can't say fairer than that, can you?
SACD, that is compatible with the old format as well, isn't it?
Well, if it's a dual-layer hybrid disc, it is. And the thing is, that's what Naxos are bringing out, and that's what I think most companies who are doing SACD are having to recognize realities. What you're in effect getting is 2 CDs in one, sort of sandwiched one layer upon the other, and the machine reads whichever is the appropriate layer. So if you've got an old CD player, then your player reads the CD layer, and if you've got an SACD player, then it will read the other layer. See what I mean? And so there are some SACD-only SACDs, but don't buy them unless you've got an SACD player. So a dual-layer hybrid ones seem to be the thing. Trouble with SACDs also is you can't actually burn them at home at the moment. And so you have to send up to the factory, and the finished product is really the first you hear of it. And we've got so used to being easily able to just burn ordinary 2-channel CDs at home. Maybe some of you know something that I don't about whether an SACD burner is in the pipeline. Somebody's going to bring one out. It'll probably come. But at the moment, it's not that completely easy to master an SACD. Sadie, which is the editor I use at home, does have an SACD mastering facility, and you have to sort of study the handbook page by page and do it step by step and think, oh crumbs, have I done that bit right? I'm glad to say I have done, And we've had our first, wearing my little Collegium Records hat, we have had our first SACDs out, of course, of which that Light of the Spirit is one. But, I mean, I do think it's an exciting format. I think that the other problem with it is wires in the living room. My wife hates wires.
There is a few other things that come up. You know, you talked about format wars.
Yeah.
On the forum for editing software,
Yes.
there's a great deal of confusion for people who have access to multi-channel recordings who want to do surround sound.
Yeah.
They don't understand the difference between DVD-V and DVD-A.
No, quite.
And that doesn't help matters.
I know. Well, there's a lot of confusion out there, and I think the industry should have put their heads together, as they did with compact discs, and said, look, we're going to have one format, we're all going to agree, we're going to do it that way. And if they had, then I think it would be really better for the public, better for the industry. Better for music. Now, without any more ado, I'm sure you're dying to hear some of what was recorded this afternoon. And this is just a very simple 5-channel recording that I made, literally one microphone per channel. But this one was, let's see, here's you remember the little 4-channel round that Chris wrote specially? Let's just find this one. And play you that. thanks to the drop in price, really, of recording equipment, multi-channel recording is now available, really, to anybody who can, well, you know, you can buy a Tascam multi-channel digital recorder for what, you know, £1,000 or something, you know. There's an awful lot less than that sort of thing used to be. When you think that digital multi-channel recorders, when they started, were sort of the size and weight of gas cookers, you know, and now this is what I recorded this afternoon's thing on, just that little portable box. And the players, of course, have dropped in price. That any Sony CD player costing over about £200, they throw in an SACD with it, you know, an SACD playing facility with it. The amplifier you were listening to this on is a cheapie, and it's got, I have to say, a slightly pumped up sort of sound to it, but it's only £400. You know, so that's 6 channels of amp with an FM tuner for good measure. So that's actually less than £100 per channel that one's paying for that, and for domestic listening, it's perfectly fine. Technical note here, this is the second model that Sony produced, and the one they did before that, which is now not available, but I've got one at home, is much better for some reason. It was the first one, and all 6 channels are just fabulous, I think, for the money. This one, which came along as £100 cheaper, actually isn't quite as good. But nonetheless, it seems to me that just having those rear channels, I certainly felt, and always have, the moment you take the rear channels out, you've lost something. And so there it is. It's come, it's happened. The future is with us. And I'm excited by it as a musician. And for me, that's the most important thing, that it does draw me into the music, I find, closer than I was before. And yes, recorded sound is only a photograph, an impression of something that once happened. Nonetheless, it's still interesting how far it's advanced just in these last few years. And it's fascinating for me to have an opportunity to just share these thoughts with you, because I know that this is something you all feel passionately about too. And I don't think I've ever addressed a gathering of sound recording people before. It's the first time, probably the last time I'll ever be asked to. But any questions from any of you before we... Yes?
So when you're recording in the cathedral,
yeah,
it's very, very reverberant.
it is.
The choir has to sort of learn to sort of sing using that acoustic.
Well, they do. The thing is, in this country, you usually find, it's always interesting, when you get American visiting choirs coming to sing in English cathedrals, they often have trouble because they're just not used to that much reverb. But it's a question of diction, it's a question of pacing, and it's the conductor as much as the choir. But oddly enough, Ely Cathedral itself is not all that fantastically reverberant. It's the Lady Chapel that is. And there is a technique to singing in there. It's not difficult to record in there. You know, you can't go wrong. You know, you really can't. I mean, just stick up a microphone and it's wonderful. As far as I'm concerned, it's wonderful.
Did you actually stay in the chapel, or did you move outside?
No, we stayed in the chapel. I mean, my control room that I used was actually a broom cupboard, which has now gone with the extension they've built, linking the cathedral and the Lady Chapel. But, yes, the recording was all made actually in the Lady Chapel.
You monitored outside the chapel?
I did,
yeah.
Yes. I did. I mean, you really do want a control room acoustically quite separate from where you're if you really want to hear what you're doing. I mean, this afternoon I was happy to just listen on headphones in the church, and well, you know, that's fine. But for serious purposes, you want to be somewhere else, I would think.
Have you got the long speakers?
Yes. Yes, I do. I've got very mixed feelings about headphones. They're very useful. Certain things like bad edits show up sometimes more readily on headphones than they do on loudspeakers. Things like traffic noise, or extraneous noises generally, speakers are much more forgiving. Headphones, therefore, are a tool. I don't think it's good to use them for long periods, because what happens is that you find the volume creeps up. You don't think you're listening loud, but you listen louder and louder. It's terribly bad for your ears. I think, to actually have any sound source that close to your eardrum. And so I use headphones with great caution, and if not for long periods. Yeah.
You earn your living as a professional composer.
Yeah.
Do you do any commercial recording?
Well, yes, I mean, I do on my own label when I'm not conducting, if you see what I mean. The recording you heard of Clare Choir, I was the producer / engineer, just because I thought, well, why not, you know, and...
You actually have your own label?
Yes, I do. I started my Collegium label 20 years ago, really as a vehicle for recordings I wanted to make with my chamber choir, the Cambridge Singers. And I've almost always kept it to that. And so therefore, I've done my own editing, but not my own. Obviously, you can't conduct and produce and engineer all at once. And so I've used various sound engineers over the years on the albums I've made. But when I'm not conducting, if I have like a guest artist on the label, like Tim Brown and Clare Choir, then there's no reason I can't actually do the engineering and producing myself. Just because I enjoy it, you know. Why not? As good a reason as any. Most people know in their hearts that it is only an impression, it's a photograph, and the actual quality of the sound for most people is a secondary consideration, really. Which doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a top end. You know, there must always be people who are leading the way and trying to record things better and better and more faithfully. What makes classical music recording particularly difficult is that you're trying to reproduce something real. Pop music, you're not doing that because the real sound is defined as the recording. Do you know what I mean? It's been created electronically in the first place. And with classical music, you're trying to replicate a real musical live experience. So it's always much more challenging. You need much better equipment to do it. And there is generally, I think it's recognized, quite a lot of skill and training. There's different skills to being a pop engineer, but you're not trying to reproduce anything that ever existed in the real world. No, well, of course, part of that is that there was always, from when cassettes were invented, that was always there as a convenience format. And as you remember, cassettes are not really that terrific from the audio standpoint. I mean, that you can make good ones with a lot of care and attention. But what people wanted was the convenience of the cassette, that you could just stick it in your kitchen cassette player, into your car. And when cassettes went, actually nothing came along to replace them. And so what's now, I mean, MP3 and all that downloading, in a sense, is the second format. It's the replacement that's appeared after about a 10-year gap for cassette. That's the way I see it. And of course, whether it spells doom and the end for the record industry as we know it and for record sales, I don't know. I'm not convinced that it's that bad, you know, that everybody says, oh, downloading, it's the death of us all. You can't give a downloaded track as a Christmas present. You know, we've written on with a felt tip pen, you know. I mean, people still want, if you buy an opera, you still want to see the words, you know, you still want a booklet, you still want all the information that goes with it. Kids always did sort of make cassettes of their favorite tracks that they hadn't paid for. They took them off Top of the Pops on the radio or wherever, or just, you know. And the modern day equivalent of that is just file sharing. But, I mean, it seems to me that records are still being bought and sold in the normal way in shops. And I think they will continue to, probably. But, I mean, maybe I'm just an optimist. Well, there's huge controversy about it because everybody's got their own ideas. What I personally have used this afternoon was just a couple of, there was no RTF. You know, that's to say 2 cardioids pointing sort of 90 or 100 degrees, you know, left and right. Just another cardioid pointing in the center, which I just ported to the center. And then a couple of cardioids pointing backwards. That's where the controversy is, because some people say that what you need is a couple of, what I did this afternoon, which is to have the surround speakers close behind, the surround mics close behind the main mics pointing back. And others say, no, put them right at the back of the building.
Where the speakers would be.
Yes, well, that's right, yes, indeed, and pointing forwards. And the thing is, there's no real agreement. You then do get a certain amount of time delay, of course, which you can correct for. But the book on the subject, which is interesting, is just called, I think it's called Surround Sound. It's by Francis Rumsey, who lectures at the University of Surrey in audio techniques. And he's described in painstaking detail all the different ways people have done surround recording and his own recommendation. But what he recommended in the end was what I did this afternoon, which is the surround pair close behind the main ones and just pointing backwards.
Yep.
But then there's people who, you know, there's no, it's like choosing the right wine to go with dinner, isn't it? You know, that, I mean, for some people, you know, 2 omnis with a disc between them is perfect, and for others, you know, spaced omnis. They all have advantages and disadvantages. Well, unless you're listening to it in the open air, assuming you're listening in an auditorium, you are actually hearing sound from behind you. You really are. It's bouncing off the back wall, bouncing back at you, and that's what tells you, I'm in the Usher Hall in Edinburgh, or I'm in the Concertgebouw, or I'm in Winchester Cathedral. That a lot of that information from behind you, you see, we Homo sapiens have got inherited from animals very good directional hearing. That's how animals tell where danger's coming from. And the thing is that it's actually artificial to only have sound coming at you from in front. Now, I know you're going to say, well, yes, but of course they bounce, the speakers, you know, the recorded sound bounces off the back wall. But all you're getting is just a reflection of the front sound, if you see what I mean. With surround sound, what you're getting from behind you is what actually would come from behind you. The thing is that one of the things that's important is to set it up right, and if I'd had longer, I would have perhaps tweaked the levels more carefully, because you don't want the rear speakers turned up so loud that the performance starts to migrate, you know, that it's still got to be in front of you if it is in front of you. And the level of the surround speakers may be quite low. And there's just a perfect point. The correct level for the surround speakers, I reckon, is just before the orchestra starts to come adrift from its position in front of you and float towards you. And then once it starts to do that, just turn the back speakers down one little notch, and then it'll probably be right. No, I've never noticed that Sadie, which is the editor I use, performs any differently with multi-track than with 2-track. You know, if it works in 2-track, it'll work in 8-track, as far as I've always found. And I think, if anything, it might be more forgiving, because there's probably more ambience that floats around and covers up any little editing blips. So, thank you. Oh, just one little story I can't resist telling you. I've only done one other surround sound demonstration, and that was for the Norwich Music Society, of which I'm a patron. And I played them some of the same recordings I've played you, and they were very appreciative and all the rest of it. And I got a nice letter of thanks afterwards from the secretary, who was, shall we say, an older gentleman. And he said, well, dear Mr. Rutter, he said, you know, I was very interested to hear all that surround sound. It's all very nice, but do you know, for real listening pleasure, you can't beat my horn gramophone with the thorn, the thorn needle. He said, there you are.